I want to start off talking about the ancient history of the Middle East. I'm doing this in part because so much that is going on today in the Middle East is the product of events that were set in motion over 1,000 years ago. The Middle East is characterized by a history of conflict. Of course, that's not so different from many other places, but it's pretty impressive the sheer number of civilizations that have fought over the Middle East, including Sumerians, Babylonians, Egyptians, Hittites, Egyptians again, Canaanites, Phoenicians, Hebrews, Aramaeans, Assyrians, Chaldeans, Persians, and the Medes. The list really just keeps going, and that's just the ancient history. So if we have to start somewhere, let's start in 332 BC, where Alexander the Great, through treachery, a combination of treachery and spending a lot of men, takes the city of Tyre, which is on the eastern seaboard of the Levant, of the Mediterranean Sea, in the Levant, in what was then called Phoenicia. At that point, an era of Hellenic influence, I say Greek influence, that lasts for centuries, starts in the Middle East. And this era can still be, or this influence, this Hellenic influence, can still be felt in parts of Turkey, Syria, and Lebanon. From 211 BC, Rome begins to flex its muscle in the region. Technically, the Ptolemies of Egypt and the Seleucids of Persia are fighting for dominion in what we would call today the Middle East, that is to say, the Levant and Mesopotamia. But Rome is beginning to look east after conquering most of Europe and North Africa, and indeed the East is the jewel. That is where a lot of the riches are, not in Europe. In 29 BC, Emperor Augustus finally takes Egypt and the Levant, and this period of Roman rule lasts for 400 years, and this is a period of relative peace and stability in the Middle East. So, one thing to note here is that we have a heavy mixing of cultures and language in the Middle East. The Levant is at the crossroads of Persia, Egypt, Europe, and Africa. Really a big mixing of one over the other, and we'll see successive invasions and successive hegemonies will bring about changes in language, ethnicity, and religion to create a really pretty stunningly diverse mix. In 30 AD, Christianity begins to spread in earnest, including in the Middle East. St. Mark brings Christianity to the Egyptians by 100 AD, and that tradition of Christianity really has not died in Egypt. The Coptic Christians are still about 10% of the Egyptian population. In 330 AD, Constantinople is founded, and the Eastern Roman Empire continues to rule in Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey, the Levant, and even occasionally Egypt. This Eastern Roman Empire eventually becomes the Byzantine Empire and eventually outlives the Western Roman Empire, which falls in the around 400 AD. Really, the Middle East is basically the heirs of the traditions of antiquity, and the Byzantine Empire lasted into the 10th and early 11th centuries. The Muslim era in the Middle East begins, well, a little after 570 AD. In 570 AD, Muhammad, the Prophet, is born in Mecca, which is currently in Saudi Arabia and the Arabian Peninsula. And in 20 years, he manages to unite all of Arabia under his banner. Muhammad is exceptional because he is both a political and a religious leader. He leads armies, and he also brings with him a new religion to the area. And his successors, Muhammad's descendants and successors, enjoy even greater success. The Rashidun, who are the four official successors of Muhammad, conquer Persia, Egypt, as well as eastern Anatolia. And after the Rashidun, the Umayyad dynasty conquers Algeria, Morocco, Spain, Portugal, as well as most of Pakistan and Afghanistan by AD 750. So from 570 to 750, These Arab empires spread from Arabia all the way into Europe and the West, and all the way into India in the East. If we look at the extent of the Caliphate in 750, you can see that very quickly a huge empire was created. Uh, the Byzantine Empire still resists and controls most of Turkey and southern Europe, but all of North Africa, all of Arabia, and well into the Indus Valley, this caliphate has spread. And the caliphate here is simply the extent of the rule of the caliph. The caliph is the spiritual and political leader of Islam. We will see that separation of the religion and politics is complicated and difficult in the Muslim tradition. Of course, it was also very complicated and difficult in the Christian tradition at one point. Now, with this first caliphate, or the succession of caliphates, two processes really begin. And these are important to bear in mind, and they have direct relevance to the politics of today. Arabization, on the one hand, that is to say, the language of Arabic begins to take over as the lingua franca, as the language that most ordinary people speak. Prior to the Arab conquests of the Middle East and North Africa, people spoke a whole lot of different languages. The upper class, the nobles or landowners, often spoke the language of whoever happened to be in power at the time. So many of them, for example, spoke Greek. However, most of the people spoke a really dizzyingly diverse number of languages, where Aramaic being one of the most popular in the Levant. Aramaic was the language that, by most accounts, Jesus Christ spoke. But Aramaic was pretty much all but wiped out, as was Coptic Egyptian. That is to say, the Egyptian spoken by the pharaohs. That language was also pretty much wiped out by the progress of Arabic. So unlike other conquerors who spread their language only to the upper classes, the Arabs really spread their language to everyone, and as a result, Arabic now today is the dominant language all over the Middle East, although there is a fair amount of variation in the practice and speech of Arabic. A second process that occurred, in addition to Arabization, was Islamization. More and more peoples of the Middle East convert to Islam for a large variety of reasons, but Islam is fairly inclusive at this time. That is to say, conversion is fairly easy, unlike, say, Judaism. So conversion is quite easy, and Islam, although associated with Arabic, and although most of the upper classes will be Arabic ethnically, the people as a whole, the average person in the street, so to speak, finds it generally to his or her advantage to convert to Islam. The laws are easier, and there is always the promise of a share of the spoils of future conquests. After 750, you might say that the empire stabilizes somewhat, and a golden age sort of ensues, where Islam and the Caliphate really are arguably the dominant civilization in the world. I mean, of course, there is still China, which is a very large and very well-developed civilization to the east, but what you have is kind of a really serendipitous mix that leads to quite a few innovations in arts, in crafts, in technology, in economics, in agriculture, as well as in mathematics and art. So, to give you some example of the things that happened during this era, the windmill is invented in 634. The chess is invented and spreads all over the world. You might not think this is important, but regular washing and bathing are spiritual requirements in Islam, and include soap. One of the most offensive things to the Muslims about the Crusaders was their odor, was the fact that they simply did not bathe. Around 800, Jabir ibn Hayyan publishes texts in chemistry, outlining things like distillation, and this eventually gave rise to perfume, alcoholic spirits, sulfuric acid, nitric acid. All of these things were incredibly advanced for their time. Let's not forget the bank check, from the Arab word sek, seems to have been used to avoid transporting money across dangerous terrain, because you had to imagine yourself at a certain time that when money was gold, money was very heavy, and transporting large quantities of it was both hazardous and cumbersome. So if you could have a piece of paper that essentially signified the transfer of funds, and particularly a piece of paper that could be drawn upon in banks at various ends of your trips, you have the beginning of a banking system that is a lot more convenient. Also around 800, Arab astronomers had concluded the Earth was round. The ancient Greeks also had come up with this, but they had this knowledge had been largely forgotten. Uh, the Arabs calculated the Earth's circumference with an error of about 120 miles, and really in the West, this knowledge was only recovered 700 years later. In 825, Al-Khwarizmi publishes the first text of recorded modern algebra, including trigonometry. We get the word algebra from the Arabic. Around 900, Al-Zahawi gives the Arab world surgical instruments that are largely ignored by the West, but now they're used pretty much everywhere, including forceps, bone saws, fine scissors, and other sort of gruesome tools of the medical trade. Unfortunately, what they did not invent was anesthesia, so the practice of medicine was still in its relative infancy. Okay, so the Golden Age goes on for a while, from 750. In 861, the empire starts to crumble. And by 950, the Levant again is the crossroads of conflict. So we see, an era of peace with the Romans, and then another era of peace with the various caliphates. But by 950, this era is essentially over, and the Byzantines really want to invade, really want to expand at this time. The Byzantines are, again, as a reminder, this Christian empire based out of Constantinople, which is currently Istanbul. And so they invade Syria a number of times with not a whole lot of success. The Fatimids set up a Shia empire, a kind of competing rival caliphate in Cairo. We will talk about the Sunni-Shia split shortly, not in this lecture, but hopefully in the next one. But suffice it to say that religious divisions start breaking up the empire, and finally there's ethnic tensions also with the Seljuk Turks, who are coming in from Central Asia, and they sack Baghdad and basically the remnants of the Abbasid dynasty, which claimed descent from Muhammad. Now, a quick, shall we say, detour to talk about the Crusades. Traditionally, the Byzantines were the protectors of the Christians in the Levant, in the Near East. But a defeat to the Seljuk Turks of the Byzantine armies starts spreading panic in Rome, and ends up motivating the First Crusade. And in 1099, the Crusaders sack Jerusalem and kill just about everybody in it, including Jews and Christians. This was perhaps not the best of moves. The Levantines thought the behavior of the Crusaders was so bad that the Seljuk Turks and the Abbasid Arabs put away their grievances to drive the Crusaders out. These were empires that were at war, but they were so shocked by the Crusader incursion that they were persuaded to put aside their differences and drive the Crusaders out. And it's worth noting that when they recaptured Jerusalem in 1187, the Muslims did not massacre the remaining Christians. So, again, a sort of staggering difference in culture, really. Pockets of Christians did continue to remain throughout the Levant, and of course there were more crusades than the first one, but none really remained politically independent, and certainly Christians were around, but they were politically dominated from there on. The Mongols. The Mongols are an interesting episode in the Middle East. Mongols, of course, coming from Central Asia and, of course, modern-day Mongolia. Uh, Genghis Khan conquered Persia in 1220, and his grandson Hulagu defeated the Seljuk Turks and takes over most of Turkey as well as Baghdad in 1243. The Mongols are finally defeated of, really, you know, they suffer a defeat. Had they not been defeated, it's not clear where they would have stopped. So it was really a last-ditch defense of Egypt by the Mamluk leaders of Egypt, and it looks like the era of Arabization and Islamization of the Middle East is really finally going to be over, as the Mongols essentially import their culture and their language. But in 1295, in a fairly surprising development, the Mongol Khan at the time decides to convert to Islam. He finds it just easier to convert to Islam in order to rule the area, and this ends basically the religious threat to Islam in the Middle East. I think, there's a lot to be said. There's a lot to we can't really know what the motivations of the Mongol Khan were, but when we have to assume that ruling Muslims is easier if you are also a Muslim and if you can claim to be the leader of the Muslim world religiously as well as politically. Okay, so I'm going to break off there and come back in a minute to talk about the Sunni Shia split as well as move a little bit forward in history.